Hello everyone, and I'm here to guide you into a peaceful slumber. If you find this video helpful, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. I'd love to know where you're from and what time it is as you unwind. So, settle in, get cozy, and let the relaxation begin. The northern lights painted the sky above my cabin the night I first heard it. That low, guttural sound that didn't belong to any animal I recognized in my 15 years as a ranger. My name is Maka, meaning earth in Lakota, though my connection to my heritage had grown thin over the years, like winter ice on a warming lake. The Alaska wilderness had become my sanctuary after everything fell apart back in Minnesota. The divorce, the custody battle for my daughter that I lost, the mounting debt from legal fees that seemed to multiply with each passing month. When the job opening came up for a backcountry ranger position in Denali National Park, I applied without hesitation. The pay wasn't great, park service salaries never are, but the position came with housing. A small cabin tucked between ancient spruce trees, far from the administrative buildings and tourist centers. The isolation suited me. After spending my days helping lost hikers, tracking wildlife movements and maintaining trails, I'd return to my cabin, light the wood stove, and lose myself in books about local folklore and history. It was during one of these reading sessions that I first came across mention of the Skinwalker legends. Not native to Alaska, these were Navajo stories, but something about them resonated with me, perhaps because I was already feeling disconnected from my own cultural roots. That first night, when the sound came, I convinced myself it was just a wounded moose or perhaps wolves on a hunt. But deep down, I knew better. In my years of wilderness experience, I'd heard every natural sound these forests could produce. This was something else. My cabin was simple but comfortable, one main room with a kitchenette, a small bathroom, and a loft where I slept. The walls were lined with bookshelves I'd built myself, filled with field guides, survival manuals, and the folklore collections that had become my obsession. A large map of the park took up most of one wall, marked with red pins indicating areas where hikers had gone missing over the years. There were more pins than there should be. The Park Service kept the official count low, bad for tourism to advertise how many people wandered into these woods never to return. But I kept my own tally. It was part of my job to find the lost after all. And I was good at it. Too good, some said, like I had some sixth sense for tracking humans through the wilderness. The truth was simpler. I understood how people think when they're afraid, when the vastness of the wilderness overwhelms them and panic sets in. My radio crackled on the table. Ranger Maka, you copy? Over. I picked it up. Copy, Bill. What's up? Over. Got a call from state troopers. Hiker reported missing near your sector. Last seen 2 days ago on the Savage Alpine Trail. Family's getting worried. Can you start a preliminary search at first light? Over. Copy that. I'll head out at sunrise. Any details on the missing person? Over. Young male, 28, experienced hiker according to the family. Had proper gear. Name's Marcus Davidson. Should have checked in at the backcountry office yesterday. Never showed. Over. I'll find him. Over and out. I placed the radio down and moved to the window, staring out at the darkness beyond. The northern lights had faded, leaving only blackness broken by countless stars. As I stood there, planning tomorrow's search route, I heard it again. Closer this time. A sound like someone trying to mimic human speech without understanding how vocal cords work. And then, unmistakably, my name carried on the wind. Maka. I reached for my rifle, kept loaded for bear protection, and flicked off the cabin lights. Standing in darkness, I listened as something circled my cabin. Its movements too deliberate for an animal, too fluid for a human. When morning came, I convinced myself it had been my imagination, the isolation finally getting to me after 3 years alone in these woods. I gathered my gear, calibrated my GPS, and headed out to find Marcus Davidson, pushing the night's terrors from my mind. I didn't know then that finding Marcus would be the beginning of my nightmare, not the end of it. The morning fog hung like a shroud over the spruce forest as I set out from my cabin. My pack contained the essentials: first aid kit, extra layers, emergency shelter, 3 days worth of food, and my SAR equipment. Experience had taught me that search and rescue operations could stretch on, especially in the vastness of Denali. Marcus Davidson's last known location was 8 miles from my cabin, a moderate hike under normal circumstances, but nothing about this search felt normal. The air seemed heavier somehow, filled with an electricity that made the hair on my arms stand on end despite the morning chill. I'd been a ranger long enough to develop intuition about these searches, whether they'd end with a grateful, embarrassed hiker or with a body bag. This one felt different. Wrong. The trail showed signs of recent use, boot prints roughly matching the description of Marcus's hiking shoes. I followed them diligently, noting where he'd stopped, where he'd veered off trail briefly before returning. Standard behavior for a photographer, which his family said he was. 4 hours in, the tracks suddenly changed. The confident stride of an experienced hiker became erratic, with deeper heel impressions suggesting he'd started running. I knelt down, examining the trail closely. There were no predator tracks, no bear or wolf signs that would explain a sudden flight. "What spooked you, Marcus?" I muttered, standing to scan the surrounding forest. That's when I noticed it. A faint impression in the soil beside Marcus's tracks. It resembled a human footprint, but was wrong somehow. The proportions were off, toes too long, the arch too pronounced. I'd tracked everything from grizzlies to wolverines across this park, but I'd never seen prints like these. I photographed them, then continued following Marcus's trail. The running tracks led to a small clearing, then vanished entirely. Not gradually, as tracks do when they fade into rocky terrain, but abruptly, as if Marcus Davidson had simply ceased to exist mid-stride. I spent the next 4 hours expanding my search in concentric circles from the clearing, finding nothing. As afternoon faded toward evening, I made the decision to set up camp rather than risk a return journey in darkness. After radioing my position to headquarters, I established a small campsite at the edge of the clearing. That night, as I huddled in my tent reviewing the day's search data on my tablet, I heard movement outside. Slow, deliberate footsteps circling my tent. I reached for my bear spray, listening intently. The steps were too light for a bear, too measured for a moose or caribou. "Hello?" I called out. "Marcus, is that you?" The footsteps stopped. Then came a voice that still haunts my dreams. Ma-ka, just like last night at my cabin, but closer now. The voice was attempting to mimic human speech, but couldn't quite manage it, like hearing someone talk underwater. I unzipped my tent slowly, knife in one hand, flashlight in the other. The clearing was empty, bathed in moonlight. But at the forest's edge, just at the boundary where my light couldn't quite penetrate, stood a figure. It was roughly man-shaped, but too tall, too thin. Its limbs seemed too long for its body, bent at angles that would be impossible for human joints. It wore what looked like animal hides, and though I couldn't make out its face clearly, I saw eyes reflecting my flashlight beam, not with the red or green eyeshine of an animal, but with an unnatural pale blue luminescence. For a moment, we regarded each other across the clearing. Then it stepped back into the trees, moving with an unnatural fluidity, like smoke curling through branches. I didn't sleep that night. I sat with my back against a tree, rifle across my lap, watching the forest line until dawn broke. When I reported in the next morning, I mentioned only that I'd found tracks suggesting Marcus had been running from something before his trail vanished. I said nothing about the figure I'd seen or the unnatural footprints. They already thought I was getting strange after 3 years of isolation. Talk of skinwalkers would only confirm their suspicions. What I didn't know then was that Marcus Davidson wasn't the first to disappear in that particular area. He was the 7th in 2 years, a fact the Park Service had carefully kept from even its rangers. I returned to my cabin after 3 more fruitless days searching for Marcus Davidson. The official search would continue with additional rangers and volunteers, but my supervisor granted me 2 days off to recover. Standard procedure after an intensive search operation, especially one ending without closure. The familiar sight of my cabin should have brought comfort, but as I approached through the lengthening evening shadows, something felt off. The door stood slightly ajar, though I was certain I'd locked it before leaving. Inside, nothing appeared disturbed at first glance, no signs of animal intrusion or break-in. Then I noticed the map on my wall. The red pins marking disappearances had been rearranged, no longer scattered across different regions of the park. They now formed a distinct pattern, a spiral centered precisely on my cabin's location. My hands trembled as I stared at the map. I hadn't created this pattern. Someone, or something, had been in my cabin. I checked my bookshelves next and found my journal open on my desk, pages ruffled. One particular page caught my attention, a passage I'd written months ago about Navajo Skinwalker legends, comparing them to similar creatures in other Native American folklore. Several lines had been underlined with what looked like dirt or ash. Unlike most supernatural entities, skinwalkers were once human, medicine men who gained power through breaking taboos and committing evil acts. They wear animal skins to transform, moving with impossible speed and able to mimic the voices of loved ones to lure victims. Cold sweat beaded on my forehead as I remembered the voice that had called my name in the darkness. I slammed the journal shut and did a thorough sweep of the cabin, rifle in hand, checking every corner, the bathroom, the loft. Nothing. I spent that night with my back against the door, jumping at every creak and groan of the cabin settling in the cold. When exhaustion finally claimed me near dawn, I dreamed of running through endless trees, pursued by something I couldn't see but could hear, a rattling breath and the snap of twigs under footpaws that were neither fully human nor fully animal. I woke to my radio crackling. "Marker, you copy? Got some news about your missing hiker, over." I grabbed the radio, voice hoarse. "Copy. Go ahead, over." "Search team found his backpack about 2 miles east of your last position. No sign of Davidson, but there was a hesitation. The pack was torn apart, not by bears or wolves. Looks like someone took a knife to it. Every piece of identification was removed. Camera's memory card missing too, over." My mouth went dry. "Any blood evidence?" "Over. Negative. But there's something else. The team found some markings carved into trees around where the pack was discovered. Symbols kind of like petroglyphs. The cultural resource team is documenting them now. Thought you might want to know, given your interest in local folklore, over." "Send me photos when you can. I'll check it out tomorrow. Over and out." I placed the radio down, my mind racing. Markings. I pulled out my laptop and began searching through digital archives of native symbols, particularly those associated with skinwalker legends. Most information was limited. Many tribes consider it dangerous even to speak of such beings, believing that attention attracts them. As darkness fell, I found myself constantly looking out the windows, checking and rechecking that my doors and windows were secured. The isolation that had once been my comfort now felt like a vulnerability. Around midnight, as wind howled around my cabin's eaves, my phone pinged with an email from headquarters containing the photographs of the tree markings. My blood ran cold as I examined them. Though crude, they clearly depicted a man-like figure with elongated limbs and what appeared to be an animal skull for a head. Below it was a spiral symbol identical to the one now formed by the pins on my map. As I stared at the images, the wind outside suddenly died. The forest fell unnaturally silent. No owls, no rustling leaves, nothing. Then came a soft scratching at my door, like claws or long fingernails tracing patterns in the wood. I grabbed my rifle and flashlight, heart pounding so loudly I could barely hear anything else. The scratching continued, methodical and patient, as if whatever was out there had all the time in the world. "Who's there?" I called out, voice steadier than I felt. The scratching stopped. Silence stretched for 10 long seconds. Then, "Help! Me! Marcus, help!" The voice was Davidson's. I recognized it from the family's voicemail I'd been given to help identify him if found. But the cadence was wrong, the words formed as if by something learning human speech. I knew what stood outside my door wasn't Marcus Davidson, but knowing didn't make the voice any less effective as bait. Every instinct as a search and rescue ranger screamed at me to open the door to help the lost soul outside. Instead, I backed away, rifle trained on the entrance. "Whatever you are," I whispered, "you're not welcome here." A low chuckle responded, a sound no human throat could produce. Then silence again, but somehow I knew it remained, waiting just beyond my walls. I didn't sleep that night, or the next. By the third day, exhaustion clouded my judgment, and I began to wonder if I was losing my mind. But the rearranged pins on my map and the photos of those carved symbols weren't hallucinations. Something was hunting in my forest, and somehow it had marked me. I requested a week of emergency leave citing personal reasons. My supervisor sounded relieved. Apparently my appearance had deteriorated noticeably during the Davidson search. Dark circles shadowed my eyes, and my normally composed demeanor had given way to constant vigilance, checking over my shoulder during conversations. Rather than leaving the park as everyone assumed I would, I drove to the nearest town, stocked up on supplies, and returned to my cabin with a new purpose. If something was stalking me, I needed to understand what it was and how to fight it. My first stop was the cultural center on the edge of the park, where I spoke with an elderly Athabascan man named Thomas, who worked as a cultural liaison. I chose my words carefully, framing my questions in terms of research for visitor education programs. When I mentioned the symbols found near Davidson's backpack, Thomas's expression changed instantly. "Where did you see these?" he asked, voice dropping to a whisper. I showed him the photos on my phone. His weathered hands trembled slightly as he examined them. "This is not from our people," he said finally. "This is Navajo. It should not be here." He handed back my phone as if it burned his fingers. "Someone brings trouble from the south. What kind of trouble?" I pressed. Thomas glanced around the empty cultural center before responding. "We do not speak of skinwalkers here. It is not our way, but I have heard stories from Navajo friends." He leaned closer. "They say that speaking of such creatures invites their attention, that they target those who know of them or fear them. How do you stop one?" I asked, abandoning all pretense. Thomas's eyes widened. "You think you have seen such a thing?" "I don't know what I've seen," I answered honestly. "But people are missing, and something is out there that doesn't belong." He was silent for a long moment before reaching into his pocket and removing a small leather pouch. "Protective medicine," he explained, placing it in my palm. "Not for skinwalkers specifically, we have no such preparations, but for negative energies, malevolent spirits. It may help." I thanked him, but as I turned to leave, he caught my arm. "Ranger Maka, if what you fear is truly out there, do not face it alone. These creatures, they isolate their prey before they strike. They separate the weak from the herd." His words followed me back to my cabin, where I spent the afternoon reinforcing my doors and windows. I created a protective circle around my cabin using salt mixed with sage and cedar. Not traditional against skinwalkers according to my research, but the best I could manage with limited resources. That night, as darkness descended, I sat at my kitchen table cleaning my rifle, the protective pouch Thomas had given me hanging around my neck. Outside, the forest seemed to hold its breath. No wind stirred the trees, no animals called in the darkness. My radio crackled to life, making me jump. "Ranger Maka, come in. Emergency. Over." I recognized the voice of Carter, a fellow ranger stationed about 15 miles south of my position. "This is Maka. What's the situation? Over. Possible sighting of Davidson." Hiker reported seeing a man matching his description wandering disoriented near Mirror Lake. "I'm heading that way now, but could use backup." Over. Mirror Lake was less than 3 miles from my cabin, closer to me than to Carter's station. Every fiber of my being screamed danger, but I couldn't ignore a possible survivor sighting. "Copy that. I'll approach from the north side. ETA 30 minutes. Over. Thanks." Probably nothing, but worth checking. Over and out. I geared up quickly. Warm clothes, headlamp, first aid kit, GPS, radio, and my rifle. As I stepped outside, the night air felt electric, charged with an energy that raised the hair on my arms. I hesitated at the edge of my salt circle, then forced myself to cross it. My duty as a ranger came first, whatever personal fears I might harbor. The trail to Mirror Lake was well maintained, easy enough to follow even by headlamp. As I hiked, I tried raising Carter on the radio several times, but received only static in response. The silence of the forest was absolute. No insects chirping, no night birds calling, not even the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. I reached Mirror Lake in 25 minutes, scanning the shoreline with my powerful flashlight. The lake's surface was perfectly still, reflecting the stars like a black mirror. No sign of Davidson or Carter. Carter, do you copy? I'm at the north shore of Mirror Lake. What's your position? Over. Only static answered. A feeling of wrongness settled over me as I circled the lake's perimeter. This was a trap. I knew it with bone-deep certainty, yet I continued searching, duty overpowering instinct. That's when I saw it, a figure standing motionless among the trees on the opposite shore. My light caught it briefly before it stepped behind a thick spruce trunk. It had been wearing what looked like ranger gear. Carter, is that you? I called out, rifle ready. No answer came, but as I watched, the figure emerged again. Though it wore what appeared to be a ranger uniform, its proportions were wrong, limbs too long, movements too fluid as it glided between trees. I raised my rifle, tracking the figure through my scope. Identify yourself. The figure stopped, then turned slowly toward me. Through my scope, I could see its face and my blood froze. It wore Carter's face, but wrong, like a mask that didn't quite fit. The features slightly misaligned, the eyes too wide and unblinking. "Car," it called, in Carter's voice but with that same underwater quality I'd heard before. "Help me." I backed away, keeping my rifle trained on the thing wearing my colleague's face. My radio crackled again, and this time Carter's voice came through clearly. "Marker, false alarm." Hiker was mistaken. No sign of Davidson. "Heading back to station. Where are you?" "Over." Cold horror washed over me as I realized the real Carter had never been at the lake. I'd been lured out by something else, something that now stood watching me from across the water, wearing a stolen face. I keyed my radio. "Carter, emergency situation at Mirror Lake. Do not approach. Repeat, do not approach. Over." Before I could hear his response, the creature across the lake moved. Not running, but flowing like smoke across the ground, crossing distance faster than any human could move. I fired 2 shots, then turned and ran into the forest, heading not toward my cabin, but deeper into the wilderness. I knew now what I was dealing with, and I knew my cabin's protections wouldn't be enough. Dawn found me huddled in the hollow of an ancient spruce, miles from any marked trail. I'd spent the night moving erratically through the forest, doubling back, crossing streams, using every tracking evasion technique I knew. Whether it had worked or the Skinwalker had simply chosen to let me run, I couldn't say. My radio remained silent. After the encounter at the lake, I'd turned it off, afraid the creature might somehow use it to track me or mimic other voices to lure me into another trap. Now, shivering in the early morning chill, I debated turning it back on. The Park Service would be looking for me by now. Failing to report in after an emergency call would trigger search protocols. But alerting them might only endanger more rangers. This thing, whatever it was, could apparently mimic voices and appearances. How could I warn them about something they wouldn't believe existed? I checked my supplies. 1 day's worth of emergency rations, half a canteen of water, my rifle with 17 remaining rounds, a hunting knife, and the small medicine pouch Thomas had given me. Not enough for a prolonged wilderness stay, but I couldn't return to my cabin. Not yet. Instead, I headed northwest, toward a place I'd discovered during my first year as a ranger. An old trapper's cabin so remote it didn't appear on park maps. I'd found it while tracking a wounded moose and had kept its existence to myself, occasionally using it as a personal retreat when the isolation of my ranger cabin paradoxically became too social. The journey took all day, through dense underbrush and across treacherous terrain deliberately chosen to be difficult to follow. By late afternoon, the weather had turned, bringing driving rain that soaked through my gear. Under different circumstances, the rain would have been unwelcome, but now I blessed it. Water erases tracks. I reached the trapper's cabin as dusk gathered. The small structure stood weathered but solid, hidden in a grove of black spruce. Inside was sparse: a rusty wood stove, a rough-hewn table, a platform bed with an ancient musty mattress. But it was shelter, and it was unknown. After securing the door with its heavy wooden bar, I allowed myself to collapse onto the bed, exhaustion overcoming fear. I must have fallen instantly asleep because the next thing I knew, darkness had fully claimed the forest and someone was knocking at the cabin door. Knock, 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 3 perfectly spaced, deliberately paced knocks. I froze, suddenly fully awake, hand already reaching for my rifle. "Marker?" came a voice through the door. Not Carter's this time, but Marcus Davidson's, the missing hiker. "Please, I'm hurt. I saw your light. Please help me." I remained silent, rifle trained on the door. The voice was perfect, exactly as I remembered from the family's recordings, but something in the cadence was wrong. The words formed with careful precision that spoke of imitation rather than natural speech. "I know you're in there," the voice continued, a subtle shift in its tone making it less human, more predatory. "I can smell your fear." I backed toward the cabin's single window, keeping the door in sight. "What do you want?" I called, voice steadier than I felt. A low chuckle answered, the same inhuman sound I'd heard outside my ranger cabin. "What do I want?" The voice mused, dropping all pretense of humanity. "I want what all hunters want. The chase, the terror, the feeding." "What happened to Davidson?" I demanded. "And the others?" "They fed me," came the simple reply. "As you will." The door shuddered as something heavy slammed against it. The wooden bar held, but dust rained from the ceiling. Another impact followed, the door splintering at its edges. I made a split-second decision. Rather than waiting for the inevitable breach, I fired 2 shots through the door, then lunged for the window, smashing through the ancient glass and rolling into the wet underbrush outside. Behind me, an inhuman shriek split the night, pain or rage I couldn't tell. I didn't wait to find out. I ran, letting the darkness of the forest swallow me, running blindly away from the cabin. I don't know how long I fled before my foot caught on an exposed root, sending me tumbling down a ravine. My head struck something hard, and blackness consumed me. When consciousness returned, pale morning light filtered through the canopy above. I lay at the bottom of a steep slope, my body battered but miraculously unbroken. My rifle was gone, lost in the fall. Blood had dried on my temple, and every muscle screamed in protest as I forced myself to stand. Disoriented and weaponless save for my hunting knife, I felt surprisingly calm. The absolute terror of the night had burned away, leaving a cold clarity in its wake. This thing, this Skinwalker, was hunting me, had perhaps been hunting me since I first arrived in this territory. The missing hikers, the strange tracks, the lures to isolated locations, all part of its pattern. But I was no longer running blind. I remembered Thomas's words at the cultural center and the old stories I'd researched. Skinwalkers were once human. They had human weaknesses alongside their supernatural strengths. They could be wounded. My shots last night had proven that. And if they could be wounded, they could be killed. I checked the medicine pouch still hanging around my neck. Inside were herbs I recognized, cedar, sage, tobacco, but also a fine white powder I couldn't identify, and something that looked like a small carved bone. "Protection," Thomas had said, "against negative energies." Looking up at the ravine I'd fallen down, I spotted something that gave me pause. A small cave entrance, half hidden by vegetation. Shelter, at least temporarily. a place to regroup and plan. As I approached the cave mouth, I noticed markings carved into the stone around it, symbols similar to those found near Davidson's backpack, but older, worn by time and weather. My heart raced as I realized what I might have found, the Skinwalker's lair. Logic told me to turn away, to flee back toward park headquarters and bring help. But deeper instinct pushed me forward. This creature would not stop hunting, and now I had a chance to hunt it back. I drew my knife, touched the medicine pouch for whatever protection it might offer, and stepped into the darkness of the cave. The cave opened into a narrow passage that descended steeply into the earth. The air grew colder with each step, carrying a metallic scent that reminded me of fresh blood. I should have been terrified, but a strange calm had settled over me. The calm of a ranger who had tracked wounded predators before, who understood that sometimes the hunter becomes the hunted. My flashlight revealed that the passage eventually widened into a chamber roughly 20 feet across. What I saw there stopped me cold. The walls were covered in symbols carved into the stone, spirals, stick figures with elongated limbs, and characters in a script I didn't recognize. But it was the center of the chamber that truly horrified me. A crude altar of piled stones stood there, surrounded by what could only be described as trophies, watches, backpacks, cameras, all recognizable as hiking gear. And clothing, torn, blood-stained clothing that I recognized from missing persons reports over the years. Marcus Davidson's distinctive red jacket lay at the top of the pile. Around the altar, the ground was stained dark with what could only be blood, some stains fresh enough to still glisten in my flashlight beam. The smell of death hung heavy in the air, making my stomach churn. I approached slowly, knife ready, scanning the chamber for any sign of movement. On the altar itself lay an animal skull, a wolf or coyote, I thought, adorned with feathers and small bones. Beside it was a human ranger hat, Carter's hat with his badge still pinned to it. My blood ran cold. Had it already claimed Carter too? Or was this another lure, another trap? As I stood contemplating this, a noise from the passage behind me made me spin around. Nothing was visible, but I could hear something moving toward the chamber, a sound like claws scraping stone. I quickly searched for another exit and spotted a narrow crevice on the far side of the chamber. Without hesitation, I squeezed through it, finding myself in a smaller space that appeared to be some kind of living area. A crude bed of animal furs lay in one corner. Containers made from hollowed gourds and animal skins lined crude stone shelves containing powders and liquids I didn't dare examine closely. This was where it lived. The Skinwalker wasn't just hunting in these woods, it had established a permanent lair. As I looked around, my flashlight beam caught something metallic protruding from beneath the furs. Carefully, I lifted the edge of a pelt to reveal a stunning discovery: a ranger's badge, a first aid kit, and most importantly, a service revolver. The name on the badge read Ranger J. Blackwood, a name I'd never heard before. I checked the revolver, loaded, 6 rounds. A weapon. Hope. Before I could explore further, a terrible sound echoed through the cave. Not quite a howl, not quite a scream, but something in between that raised the hair on my neck. It knew I was here. I had seconds to make a decision. Hide and hope it passed by, or confront it in its own lair with surprise on my side. The medicine pouch seemed to grow warm against my chest as I made my choice. I moved back to the crevice, positioned myself beside it with the revolver ready, and waited. I didn't wait long. A shape darkened the entrance to the main chamber, taller than a man should be, moving with a fluid grace that no human joints could manage. In the dim light filtering from my discarded flashlight, I could see it clearly for the first time. The creature wore what appeared to be a ranger uniform, but the fabric hung wrongly on its elongated frame. Its limbs bent at unnatural angles, too many joints allowing movement that mimicked a human gait, but wasn't quite right. Upon its shoulders sat what I first took to be a hood, but as it turned toward the altar, I realized with horror that it was wearing a coyote skin, the animal's head serving as a grotesque hood, with the creature's face visible within the animal's open jaws. Most disturbing were its hands, human-shaped but with fingers too long, too thin, ending in darkened nails that curved like claws. Those hands moved to the altar now, caressing the ranger hat with something like reverence or hunger. I stepped from the crevice, revolver raised. "Stop right there!" The creature went perfectly still, then slowly turned toward me. Within the coyote jaw frame, its face was almost human, but wrong in ways that turned my stomach. The official report listed Marcus Davidson and 6 other hikers as victims of a human predator who had died in the cave fire. Carter was found alive, though badly injured, in a ravine 2 miles from Mirror Lake. He remembered nothing of how he got there or why his ranger hat was missing. The Park Service offered me a commendation and a transfer to Yellowstone. I accepted both. My cabin in Denali held too many memories, too many shadows that seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them. I still work as a ranger, still help those who get lost in the wilderness. But I no longer work alone, and I never take night shifts. When the sun sets, I lock my doors and windows, draw the curtains tight, and make sure my emergency pack sits ready by the door. Because some nights, when the wind blows a certain way, I swear I can hear my name being called from the darkness between the trees. Some nights I dream of yellow eyes watching me from just beyond the firelight. And some nights, I wonder if the Skinwalker spoke true, if there are others of its kind, ancient and hungry, waiting in the deep wilderness for unwary souls to wander into their hunting grounds. So I keep a medicine pouch around my neck, a new one, blessed by Thomas before I left Alaska. I keep my fire burning through the night, and I remember that there are territories where humans are not meant to tread alone. The wilderness has always had its guardians. Sometimes those guardians hunt us back. The radio crackled to life, static buzzing through the small cabin before the dispatcher's voice cut through. Base to Outpost 17. We've got reports of hikers missing near Black Ridge Trail. 3 individuals. Last contact approximately 6 hours ago. Over. I pulled myself from the edge of sleep, fumbling for the handset. Another search and rescue operation in the making. After 15 years as a park ranger in Cascade National Forest, these calls still sent the same rush of adrenaline through my veins. Outpost 17 to base. Copy that. I'll head out immediately. Coordinates? The dispatcher rattled off the location. Deep in the northwestern sector. Dangerously close to what we rangers privately call the dead zone. Not because of cell reception, though that was certainly non-existent out there. No, the nickname stemmed from something else entirely. The unusually high number of disappearances that occurred within its boundaries. Hikers who vanished without a trace, experienced outdoorsmen who seemed to evaporate into the thick forest canopy. As I gathered my gear, I caught a glimpse of my weathered face in the small mirror above my sink. The lines around my eyes had deepened over the years, carved there by harsh winters and scorching summers alike. The forest had marked me as surely as I had marked my trails through it. Outside, darkness was setting in. Most search operations wouldn't start until dawn. But these hikers were in the dead zone. If I waited until morning, experience told me we'd find nothing but abandoned gear, if that. I shouldered my pack and checked my rifle. Not standard issue for park rangers, but those of us stationed at the remote outposts were granted certain exceptions. The wilderness didn't play by human rules, and neither did its dangers. As I stepped out into the cool night air, the trees seemed to whisper around me. Most people think forests are silent at night. They're wrong. The darkness amplifies every sound, every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig. 15 years in these woods, and I still couldn't shake the feeling that something was always watching. My flashlight cut a narrow beam through the darkness as I made my way toward my truck. The beam caught something at the edge of the clearing, a reflection perhaps, or a trick of the light. I swung the beam back, but there was nothing there. Just shadows playing among the pines. I climbed into my truck and headed out, the narrow service road winding deeper into the heart of the forest. The radio occasionally sputtered with updates, but mostly it was just me and the rumble of the engine, and the memories. 5 years ago, I'd found a book in the cabin when I was first stationed there. The Whispering Forest by Theodore Blackwood, a horror novel about a forest ranger who encounters something ancient and terrible in the woods. I'd laughed it off then, filed it under campy horror in my mind, and shelved it beside the field guides and wilderness survival manuals. But after what I'd seen in these woods, I wasn't laughing anymore. The truck's headlights caught something on the road ahead, a dark shape that moved with uncanny speed across the path before disappearing into the underbrush. Too large for a coyote, too fast for a bear. I slowed the truck, scanning the tree line. Nothing. Just your imagination, I muttered to myself, accelerating again. Focus on the hikers. But as I drove deeper into the forest, toward the dead zone and whatever awaited me there, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being herded. Like prey, the missing hikers would need to be found quickly. Night temperatures were dropping, and hypothermia was a real danger. That is, if hypothermia was the only danger they faced out here in the darkness. I turned onto the barely visible trailhead that would take me toward their last known location, the truck bouncing over exposed roots and rocks. Whatever was out there in the shadows, I was heading straight for it. Dawn broke over the forest with reluctant fingers of light that barely penetrated the dense canopy. I'd made camp at the edge of the Black Ridge Trail after the terrain became too rough for the truck. Sleep had been fitful at best. The forest has a way of keeping you alert, even when exhaustion begs otherwise. I'd been a ranger long enough to know the drill for finding lost hikers. Search for signs of disturbance. Call out at regular intervals, listen for responses. But in the dead zone, standard procedures often proved useless. People didn't just get lost here, they vanished. "Hello, Park Service," I called out, my voice echoing through the trees. The only response was the startled flutter of wings as a group of ravens took flight. As I hiked deeper into the wilderness, I documented everything with methodical precision. 3 sets of boot prints heading northeast, following the trail before veering off unexpectedly near a large rock formation. A discarded water bottle, still half full. A torn piece of red fabric, snagged on a thorny bush. The trail of evidence led me to a small clearing I'd never encountered before, despite my extensive knowledge of this section of forest. In the center stood what appeared to be a crude structure of branches and stones arranged in a pattern that was distinctly unnatural. My radio crackled to life suddenly, making me jump. "Repeat, Outpost 17. Do you copy?" "Over." I grabbed the handset. "This is Outpost 17. Go ahead, base. We've got additional information on your missing hikers. Turns out they were heading into the area to investigate local folklore. Something about the Cascade Strider or some such nonsense. Over." The Cascade Strider. My blood ran cold. It was one of many local names for the creature that allegedly haunted these woods. Bigfoot, Sasquatch, the Wild Man. Every region had its own version of the myth. Except I wasn't sure it was just a myth anymore. "Copy that, base. Any other information I should know?" "Over." "Negative. Just find these idiots before they become statistics. Base out." I clipped the radio back to my belt, surveying the clearing again. The structure in the center resembled something I'd seen once before, in a photograph attached to a report filed by a ranger who'd gone missing 10 years ago. His last documented discovery before he vanished without a trace. The report had been quietly buried by administration. "Too fantastical," they said. The ranger must have suffered a psychological break from the isolation, but I'd seen the photos. I'd read his meticulous notes. And now I was standing in front of the same kind of structure. I approached cautiously, the hair on the back of my neck standing on end. The arrangement was deliberate, branches woven together in complex patterns, stones placed at specific intervals. Not the work of hikers or campers, not the random debris of nature. Something pressed beneath my boot as I circled the structure. Looking down, I saw a smartphone in a camouflage case. One of the missing hikers, no doubt. I picked it up, hoping it might contain clues, but the battery was dead. A sound caught my attention, a low, resonant thump that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Like a massive heartbeat pulsing through the earth itself. Thump. I held my breath. Listening. Thump. The sound was moving, circling the clearing. I reached slowly for my rifle, scanning the dense wall of trees surrounding me. The forest had gone completely silent. No birds, no insects, no rustling of leaves despite the gentle breeze I could feel on my face. Thump, thump, thump. The rhythm increased, like something approaching at a run. I raised my rifle, aiming at the tree line where the sound seemed loudest. "Park Service," I shouted. "Identify yourself." The sound stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the ominous thumping. Then I saw it, a shadow moving between the trees, massive, upright, moving with a fluid grace that no bear or known predator could manage, just for a moment silhouetted against the lighter backdrop of distant foliage. Then it was gone. I stood frozen, rifle still raised, heartbeat thundering in my ears. Part of me, the rational, trained, professional part, tried to categorize what I'd seen. A bear standing on hind legs, an elaborate hoax perpetrated by the missing hikers. But deep down I knew better. Whatever I'd glimpsed was something science had no name for. Something that had been hunting these woods long before humans claimed them as protected land. And now it was hunting me. I followed the tracks deeper into the forest, each step taking me further from any semblance of safety. The day was waning, shadows lengthening across the forest floor like grasping fingers. In a few hours, darkness would reclaim these woods, and I'd be alone with whatever lurked among the trees. The missing hikers' trail had become increasingly erratic. Signs of running, of panic. Dropped gear suggested they'd fled in terror, abandoning anything that slowed them down. I collected what I could. A high-end DSLR camera, a journal filled with notes about Bigfoot sightings, a digital voice recorder. I played the recorder as I walked, listening to the excited voices of 3 young people embarking on what they called their Sasquatch safari. Their enthusiasm reminded me of a Reddit thread I'd once stumbled across titled, "I'm a park ranger and we're not allowed to talk about the staircases in the woods." The thread had detailed strange phenomena in national parks across the country, phenomena officially denied by park services but whispered about by rangers around campfires. The recording continued, documenting their journey until the tone suddenly shifted. "Did you hear that?" A female voice whispered, rustling, then silence. Then, "Jesus Christ, it's huge, run!" Phew! The recording cut off in a burst of static. I stopped the playback, a chill running through me despite the warm afternoon. Looking up, I realized I'd wandered into a part of the forest I didn't recognize. The trees here were older, massive trunks stretching skyward, canopies blocking out most of the sunlight. The undergrowth was sparse, the forest floor covered in a thick carpet of moss that muffled my footsteps. And then I saw them, the structures. Dozens of them, similar to the one I'd found in the clearing, but larger, more complex. They formed a rough circle around a central space where the moss had been cleared away, revealing bare earth. This was no random arrangement. This was deliberate, territorial, a warning. I should have turned back, called for backup. But the thought of the missing hikers pushed me forward. If they'd stumbled across this place, they would have been trespassing on something ancient and territorial. Something that might still have them. In the center of the clearing, pressed into the bare earth, was a massive footprint, at least 18 inches long, with 5 distinct toe impressions. Too large for any known primate, too detailed to be fake. I photographed it methodically, placing my own boot beside it for scale. My size 12 hiking boot looked childlike in comparison. As I knelt there, studying the print, a realization slowly dawned on me. The forest had gone silent again. No birds, no insects, Nothing but the sound of my own breathing and the blood rushing in my ears. I rose slowly, scanning the tree line, and that's when I saw them. The hikers, or what was left of them, 3 backpacks neatly arranged at the base of the largest tree at the edge of the clearing. Beneath them, 3 pairs of hiking boots, each containing the severed feet of their owners. My stomach lurched. In 15 years as a ranger, I'd seen my share of tragedies. Hikers who'd fallen to their deaths, campers mauled by bears, climbers frozen on mountainsides. But this was different. This was deliberate, ritualistic. I keyed my radio, hand trembling. Outpost 17 to base. I've found evidence of the missing hikers. Sending coordinates. Request immediate backup and medical examiner. Over. Only static answered me. I tried again. Switching channels, checking the battery. Nothing. The radio was working. But no signal was getting through, almost as if something was blocking it. A branch snapped behind me, a sound so ordinary yet so terrifying in that moment that I nearly dropped the radio. I spun around, rifle raised, to find myself staring at a wall of fur and muscle that hadn't been there seconds before. It stood at least 8 feet tall, its broad shoulders nearly spanning the width of 2 men. The body was covered in thick, dark hair, but the face, God, the face. Almost human, but not quite. Eyes that reflected intelligence and ancient rage in equal measure. We stared at each other, predator and prey, though in that moment I wasn't sure which was which. It could have killed me instantly. Instead, it studied me with an intensity that felt like it was looking straight through to my soul. Then it spoke, not in words, but in a series of deep, guttural vocalizations that resonated through my chest. I'd heard recordings of supposed Bigfoot calls before, but this was different. This had structure, cadence, intent. It was communicating. And somehow, on some primal level I couldn't explain, I understood. It was telling me to leave, to take the evidence of the hiker's fate as a warning and never return to this place. I backed away slowly, rifle still raised, but knowing it would be useless against this creature. With each step I took toward the edge of the clearing, it remained motionless, watching. Only when I reached the tree line did it move, sinking into a crouch that somehow made it seem even more threatening. I turned and ran, the sound of my panicked flight echoing through the silent forest. Behind me came that rhythmic thumping again, thump, 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 keeping pace but never closing the distance, herding me out of its territory. As I crashed through the undergrowth blind with terror, one thought kept repeating in my mind: I wasn't the hunter here. I never had been. When I finally made it back to my truck, darkness had fully enveloped the forest. I sat behind the wheel, hands shaking too badly to insert the key into the ignition. The radio bursting to life nearly sent me through the roof. Base to Outpost 17, please respond. We've lost contact for over 4 hours. Do you copy? Over. I grabbed the handset. This is Outpost 17, I said, my voice hoarse. I'm heading back to base. The hikers are dead. Over. Say again, Outpost 17. You found the hikers? Over. Affirmative. They're dead. I'll report in person. Over and out. I couldn't bring myself to describe what I'd seen over the radio. They wouldn't believe me anyway, just like they hadn't believed the ranger who disappeared 10 years ago. The drive back to my cabin was a blur. Every shadow in the headlights seemed to move. Every dark patch between the trees concealed watching eyes. By the time I pulled up to my outpost, exhaustion had overtaken fear, leaving me numb. I should have reported immediately to headquarters, but I needed time. Time to process what I'd seen. Time to decide what to tell them. Inside my cabin, I emptied my pockets of the evidence I'd collected. The smartphone, the voice recorder, my own photographs of the footprint, the strange structures. I played the voice recorder again, listening for any sounds in the background that might corroborate what I'd seen. Then I noticed the camera, the high-end DSLR I'd recovered from the hiker's abandoned gear. With trembling fingers, I turned it on and navigated to the photo gallery. The first dozen photos were what you'd expect. scenic forest shots. The three hikers posing at trailheads, close-ups of interesting fungi or plants. Then came the clearing with the structures. The hikers had found it too, documented it from every angle. And then, in the final series of photos, I found it. A blur of movement captured at the edge of the frame. I enlarged the image, my breath catching in my throat. It wasn't clear, a smudge of dark against the greens and browns of the forest. But the outline was unmistakable, a massive, upright figure moving between the trees. I sat back in my chair, staring at the photo. Proof. Not conclusive, not clear enough to convince the skeptics, but proof nonetheless. My gaze drifted to the bookshelf where Theodore Blackwood's novel sat gathering dust. I pulled it down, flipping through the yellowed pages until I found the passage I remembered. The indigenous peoples called it the guardian of the deep woods, a being neither man nor beast, but something ancient that had watched our species climb down from the trees and learn to use tools. It tolerated our presence until we began to destroy its home, cut down its forests, pollute its streams. Then it fought back, not with our weapons of steel and gunpowder, but with fear. It became the shadow in the corner of your eye, the reason your ancestors feared the dark. It became legend, myth, folklore, hiding in plain sight as a story too absurd for modern minds to believe. A chill ran through me as I read those words. Blackwood hadn't been writing fiction, he'd been documenting truth in the only form people would accept it. Something moved outside my window, a shadow passing across the glass too quickly to identify. I froze, listening to the night sounds of the forest. Was that rhythmic thumping just my imagination, or was it drawing closer to my cabin? The radio crackled again. Base to Outpost 17. Search and recovery team is assembled and ready to move at first light. Please confirm coordinates for the hiker's location. Over. I stared at the handset, knowing what I had to do. I couldn't send them in there unprepared, not knowing what waited in those woods. Outpost 17 to base. Be advised, the situation is... I paused, searching for words that wouldn't make me sound insane. The situation is more complex than initially reported. Request permission to brief the team in person before deployment. Over. Copy that. Outpost 17. Permission granted. Report to headquarters at 600. Base out. I set the radio down and returned to the window, peering out into the darkness. The forest seemed to press against the glass, the thin walls of my cabin suddenly feeling like inadequate protection. What would I tell them? How could I make them understand what was out there without sounding like I'd lost my mind? And if they did believe me, what then? A hunting party sent to kill something that had likely lived in these woods for centuries? The thought made me sick. Whatever the creature was, Bigfoot, Sasquatch, the guardian of the deep woods, it wasn't the mindless beast of campfire stories. It had intelligence, language, purpose. It had killed the hikers, yes, but they had trespassed into its domain, armed with cameras and recorders, intent on exposing its existence to the world. Wasn't that what I was planning to do now? Outside, a branch snapped, close, too close to be coincidence. It was here, watching my cabin, watching me. I made my decision then. Gathering the evidence, the photos, the recorder, the camera, I placed it all in a metal trash can outside the cabin's back door. With shaking hands, I struck a match and dropped it in, watching as the flames consumed the only proof of what I'd witnessed. When nothing remained but ashes, I whispered into the darkness, "I understand. Your secret is safe." From the edge of the forest came a soft, acknowledging grunt, then silence. Morning arrived with a heavy mist that clung to the trees, transforming the forest into a ghostly landscape of shifting shadows. I hadn't slept, spending the night alternating between watching the tree line and questioning my own sanity. Had I really destroyed evidence in some misguided attempt to protect a creature that had killed 3 people? Or was I protecting something else, something older and more important than any single human life? I rehearsed my story as I drove to headquarters. The hikers had ventured off trail, likely fallen victims to exposure and wildlife. I'd found signs of bear activity near their abandoned gear. No, I hadn't found bodies, just evidence suggesting they couldn't have survived. It was the kind of report that would be accepted without too many questions. Missing hikers in national parks weren't uncommon, and Cascade had its share of tragedies. The case would remain open but inactive, filed away with the others that had no resolution. But as I pulled into the headquarters parking lot, something stopped me. The memory of those structures in the clearing, the intelligent eyes of the creature, the ritualistic arrangement of the hikers' remains. This wasn't just another wilderness accident. This was communication, a warning that needed to be heeded. Inside, the search and recovery team was already assembled. 6 rangers, 2 with tracking dogs, all equipped for a multi-day operation. Chief Ranger Martinez nodded as I entered, her expression grim. "Bishop," she acknowledged. "I understand you have information about our missing hikers?" All eyes turned to me. This was the moment. Lie and send these people into danger, or tell the truth and face the consequences. "They're dead," I said flatly, "and we need to close Blackridge Trail permanently." Martinez's eyebrows shot up. "That's a serious request, Bishop. I'm going to need more than your word." "I know what killed them," I continued, my voice steady despite the hammering of my heart. "The same thing that's responsible for every disappearance in the dead zone for the past 50 years. The room went silent. Some of the younger rangers exchanged skeptical glances, but the veterans, those who had worked these woods as long as I had, their expressions remained carefully neutral. "You're talking about the Cascade Strider," Martinez said. Not a question, but a statement. "I'm talking about something that lives in these woods and considers a portion of them its territory," I replied. "Something intelligent enough to communicate warnings and enforce boundaries." "You've seen it?" one of the younger rangers asked, disbelief evident in his tone. I met his gaze steadily. "Yes." Martinez dismissed the search team, asking them to wait outside. When the door closed behind them, she turned to me. "Sit down, Bishop. Tell me everything, and I mean everything." So I did. The structures, the footprint, the creature itself. The way it had herded me out of its territory rather than killing me outright. The evidence I'd found and subsequently destroyed. When I finished, Martinez was silent for a long moment, studying me with unreadable eyes. "You know how this sounds," she finally said. "I do. And you destroyed the only evidence that might have supported your story." "I did." She sighed, rubbing her temples. "Why? Why protect something that killed 3 people?" "Because they trespassed," I said simply. "They went looking for it, deliberately invaded its space, tried to expose its existence. It was defending its home. That's not how the families of those hikers will see it." "No," I agreed. "It's not." Martinez stood and paced to the window, looking out at the forest that stretched to the horizon. "You know there's a file," she said quietly. "Incidents dating back to the 1970s. Rangers who reported similar encounters. Most transferred out afterward. Some quit. A few disappeared." My breath caught. "You've known all along?" She turned back to me. "I've suspected. There's a difference." She paused. "The thing is, Bishop, every year we get millions of visitors to this forest. Families, researchers, adventurers. Are you suggesting we close off entire sections because something might be living there that doesn't want to be disturbed?" "Yes," I said without hesitation. "That's exactly what I'm suggesting." "Based on what?" "A story about a monster in the woods." "I need more than that, Bishop. I need something I can take to the Department of the Interior." I had nothing to offer her. No photos, no recordings, nothing but my word. And yet I knew what I'd seen, what those hikers had found. What had happened to them could happen again. The indigenous peoples who lived here long before this became a national park had stories, I said slowly. Stories about territories that belonged to the spirit of the forest. Places humans were forbidden to enter, They respected those boundaries for generations. And you think we should do the same based on legends? I think those legends existed for a reason, I countered. I think they were warnings, passed down through generations to keep people safe. And I think we've forgotten how to listen. Martinez was quiet for a long time. Finally, she nodded. I'll recommend seasonal closures for the Black Ridge Trail and surrounding areas. Wildlife management study. It's the best I can do without evidence. It wasn't enough, but it was something. Thank you. As I left headquarters, the search team was still waiting, looking at me expectantly. Martinez would give them a sanitized version of events I knew. A story of hikers who had ventured where they shouldn't have, met with tragedy, with no bodies to recover. Some would believe it. Others would whisper around campfires about the Cascade Strider, adding to the mythology. A few might even venture into the dead zone, seeking the truth for themselves. And some of them wouldn't return. 5 years have passed since my encounter in the woods. I still serve as a ranger at Outpost 17, though I rarely venture near the dead zone these days. True to her word, Chief Martinez implemented seasonal closures for Black Ridge Trail, citing ecological studies and wildlife management. The families of the missing hikers eventually received closure of a sort, a formal declaration of death, though without bodies to bury. Their disappearance became another statistic, another tale of wilderness claiming those who underestimated its dangers. But I know the truth. Sometimes, on still nights when the forest seems to hold its breath, I hear that rhythmic thumping in the distance. Thump, 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 like a heartbeat pulsing through the trees. A reminder that I am not alone in these woods, that I never have been. I've come to understand something in these 5 years. The creature, the Sasquatch, the Bigfoot, whatever name humans have given it throughout the centuries, isn't the intruder here. We are. Its kind has lived in these forests for thousands, perhaps millions of years before the first human ever set foot in North America. They've watched us cut down ancient trees, dam rivers, build roads through pristine wilderness. They've retreated further and further into the diminishing wild places, establishing territories that grow smaller with each passing decade. Is it any wonder they defend what little remains? Not long after my encounter, I found a package on my doorstep. No postmark, no return address. Inside was a manuscript titled Guardians of the Ancient Forest. Truth Behind the Myth. The author's name was listed simply as a former ranger. The manuscript detailed encounters spanning decades across national parks throughout North America. The descriptions matched my experience with uncanny precision. The structures, the territorial behavior, the intelligence behind those searching eyes. According to the manuscript, there aren't many of them left, perhaps a few hundred scattered across the most remote wilderness areas of the continent. They avoid humans when possible, defend their territories when necessary, and only attack when provoked or threatened. They are, in essence, the last guardians of truly wild places. I keep the manuscript locked in my desk drawer, alongside Theodore Blackwood's novel and a small leather pouch I found hanging from a branch outside my cabin one morning. Inside the pouch was a single massive tooth, unmistakably primate, but larger than any known species. A gift. A warning? I'm still not sure. What I am sure of is that the forest holds secrets modern humans have forgotten how to hear. Our ancestors knew better. They created stories and legends to encode warnings about places we shouldn't go, beings we shouldn't disturb. They understood something we've lost in our rush to catalog, classify, and control the natural world. Some mysteries are meant to remain mysteries. Last month, a new ranger was assigned to the outpost nearest Black Ridge Trail. Young, eager, full of modern wildlife management theories and technological solutions. He asked me about the seasonal closures, about the dead zone, about the stories he'd heard from other rangers. I told him what I tell all newcomers: respect the boundaries. Some parts of the forest aren't meant for humans. Some territories belong to creatures older and wiser than us. Most laugh it off as the superstitions of an old ranger who spent too many years alone in the woods. Some listen politely but dismiss the warning once out of earshot. Few, the ones who've spent enough time in true wilderness to sense the ancient rhythms that still pulse beneath the surface of our modern world, they understand. They're the ones who might survive a career in these woods. Tonight, as I sit on the porch of my cabin watching darkness claim the forest, I can feel eyes watching from the tree line. Not hostile, not threatening, simply aware, watching and waiting as they have for centuries. I raise my coffee mug in a silent toast to the shadows among the pines, an acknowledgement between two species sharing this small corner of the world, one ancient and dwindling, one young and expanding, both bound by the same primeval forest. In the distance, that familiar sound, thump, thump, thump. Good hunting, I whisper to the darkness. And somewhere in the forest, something answers. It was October 2019 and my life had fallen into a predictable rhythm. At 34, I had settled into a comfortable but uninspiring job at an accounting firm in Northern California. The days blurred together, spreadsheets, client meetings, and the steady hum of fluorescent lights. My friend Andre Russo and I had known each other since college, both transplants to the area who had stayed for work rather than passion. We shared a mutual dissatisfaction with our sedentary lives, often commiserating over beers about how we'd become chained to our desks. "We need to get out more," Andre insisted one Friday evening, as we sat at our usual corner table at Lighthouse Pub. "Remember when we used to hike every weekend?" I nodded, recalling our more adventurous college days. Those mountains near Sacramento. What were they called again? The Sierra Nevadas, Andre said, smiling at the memory. "We haven't done anything like that in years." He was right. Somewhere along the way, we'd allowed ourselves to become consumed by work and responsibility. The outdoors had become something we merely glimpsed through office windows. "What about the Lost Coast Trail?" Andre suggested, pulling out his phone to show me photos. "It's supposed to be one of the most remote and beautiful stretches in California, about 3 hours north of here." The images revealed rugged coastline where forest met sea, untamed and isolated. Something stirred in me, a desire to break free from routine, to feel alive again. "We could do a day hike," I said, already warming to the idea. Nothing too ambitious, just enough to get out there again. Andre's enthusiasm was infectious. "This Saturday, we'll leave at dawn, make a day of it." That night, I researched the trail, reading accounts from hikers who described its wild beauty and challenging terrain. The more I read, the more excited I became. This was exactly what we needed, a break from the monotony, a chance to reconnect with something more primal and real than our artificial office lives. I prepared meticulously, pulling out hiking boots that had gathered dust in my closet, checking the weather forecast, clear skies predicted, and packing essentials. Water bottles, trail mix, a first aid kit, and a detailed map of the area. I even charged my camera, determined to document our return to adventure. That Friday night, I went to bed early, setting my alarm for 4:30 a.m. As I drifted off to sleep, I imagined the feel of the trail beneath my feet, the salt spray from the nearby ocean, the liberation of wide-open spaces. What I couldn't imagine was how drastically this simple hiking trip would alter everything I thought I understood about the world. Andre pulled up in his weathered Ford pickup at precisely 5 a.m. on Saturday. The pre-dawn air carried a crisp chill as I loaded my backpack into the truck bed. We stopped for coffee at a 24-hour gas station before merging onto the nearly empty highway northbound. "Weather report still looks good," Andre said, scrolling through his phone as I drove the first leg. Clear skies all day. The drive took us through small coastal towns that were just beginning to stir, past farmland shrouded in morning mist, and eventually along winding roads that curved between towering redwoods. We talked about work, mutual friends, and our plans for the coming months. Normal conversation that soon gave way to comfortable silence as the landscape grew more rugged. By 8:30 a.m., we reached the southern access point to the Lost Coast Trail. The parking area was a simple gravel lot with room for perhaps a dozen vehicles. Only 3 other cars were present, a testament to the trail's remoteness even on a beautiful Saturday in autumn. We shouldered our packs and approached the trailhead. A weathered wooden sign provided a stark warning. Attention hikers, weather conditions can change rapidly. Check tide schedules. No cell service available on trail. Register at station. After signing the trail register, we set off. The initial path led through a dense forest of Sitka spruce and Douglas fir, their massive trunks creating natural columns that stretched toward a canopy high above. Shafts of early morning sunlight broke through in places, illuminating patches of ferns and moss with an almost ethereal glow. "This is incredible," I said, pausing to take a photo of light streaming through the trees. "I can't believe we waited so long to do this." Andre nodded in agreement. "City life makes you forget places like this exist." The trail gradually descended toward the coastline. Within an hour, we caught our first glimpse of the Pacific through breaks in the trees, a vast expanse of deep blue stretching to the horizon. The sound of waves grew louder as we approached, a rhythmic backdrop to our journey. By mid-morning, the forest gave way to coastal bluffs. The trail narrowed, hugging the contours of the land as it wove between rocky outcroppings and grassy slopes. To our left rose steep hillsides covered in coastal shrubs and wildflowers. To our right, cliffs dropped dramatically to a shoreline where waves crashed against black volcanic rocks. "We picked a perfect day," Andre remarked as we paused to drink water. The sky remained cloudless, the sun warm but not oppressive. A light breeze carried the scent of salt and seaweed. We continued at a leisurely pace, stopping occasionally to photograph particularly striking vistas or to watch seabirds wheeling above the surf. The solitude was profound. We had yet to encounter another hiker, and the only sounds were natural ones. Wind in the grass, waves on the shore, the distant cry of gulls. By noon, we had been hiking for about 3 hours. My legs felt the effort, muscles pleasantly taxed after months of underuse. Andre consulted the map, confirming we had covered roughly 5 miles of the trail. "There should be a clearing just ahead," he said, folding the map and returning it to his pack. "Good spot for lunch." As predicted, the trail soon opened into a small meadow set back from the cliff edge. A large, flat boulder provided an ideal resting place with views of both the ocean and the forested hills we had traversed. Neither of us could have anticipated that this peaceful moment would mark the end of the world as we had understood it. I dropped my pack beside the boulder, stretching my arms toward the cloudless sky. The sun warmed my face as I took a long drink from my water bottle. Andre unfolded the map on the rock's surface, studying our position and the trail ahead. "If we keep this pace, we can reach Bear Harbor before turning back," he said, tracing the route with his finger. "That gives us plenty of time to make it to the truck before sunset." I nodded, only half listening as I savored the moment. The perfect weather, the spectacular view, the satisfaction of physical exertion. After months of fluorescent lights and recycled office air, each breath felt like a revelation. Then it happened. The sunlight vanished as though someone had thrown a switch. A massive shadow swept across the clearing, plunging us into sudden twilight. It wasn't the passing of a cloud. The sky remained a pristine blue. This was something else entirely, something solid and enormous moving above us. My body reacted before my mind could process what was happening. I froze mid-sip, water dribbling down my chin as my eyes darted upward. Andre fell silent, his finger stopping its trace along the map. The shadow moved with unnatural speed and silence, passing over us completely in perhaps 3 seconds. As quickly as it had come, it was gone, leaving us bathed in sunlight once more. Andre's face had drained of color. What was that? His voice emerged strained, barely above a whisper. I couldn't answer immediately. My eyes scanned the sky, searching for anything that could have cast such a shadow, an aircraft, a formation of birds, even a hang glider. But the blue expanse remained empty and undisturbed. I began, but my words were cut short by a sudden change in the air. A cold wind swept through the clearing, powerful enough to rustle the surrounding trees and send loose pages of Andre's map fluttering. This wasn't a gentle breeze, but a concentrated gust that seemed to follow in the wake of the shadow, as though intrinsically connected to whatever had passed overhead. The temperature dropped noticeably. Goosebumps rose on my arms despite the previous warmth of the day. The wind carried a scent I couldn't identify, something metallic and unfamiliar that made my nostrils flare in instinctive rejection. "Did you feel that?" Andre asked, gathering the scattered map pages with trembling hands. That wasn't normal. As suddenly as it had begun, the wind subsided. In its absence, I became aware of a profound silence that had descended upon our surroundings. The constant background noise of the forest, bird song, insect buzzing, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush had ceased entirely. Even the distant crash of waves against the shore seemed muted, as though something had pressed a dampening hand over the natural world. I strained my ears, hoping to catch some reassuring sound that would restore normalcy to the moment. Nothing came. The silence hung heavy and oppressive, an absence so complete it seemed to have physical weight. "The birds," I said finally. "They've stopped." Andre nodded, his eyes wide as they darted from the sky to the surrounding trees. "Everything has." We stood motionless in the clearing for what felt like minutes but was likely only seconds, both afraid to break the unnatural quiet. I found myself holding my breath, listening intently for any sign of what might come next. My heart hammered against my ribs with such force I was certain Andre must hear it. Whatever had passed over us, whatever had caused the shadow, the wind, and this smothering silence, remained unseen. Yet its presence lingered, an invisible pressure that seemed to watch and wait. I felt exposed in the open clearing, vulnerable beneath the empty sky. "We should go," I said finally, my voice sounding strange and muffled in the still air. "We need to go now," Andre didn't argue. He stuffed the map into his pack without bothering to fold it properly, his movements quick and jerky. I grabbed my water bottle and backpack, suddenly desperate to put distance between ourselves and this place. As we turned to leave, I cast one final glance at the sky above the clearing. Still blue, still empty, still wrong in a way I couldn't articulate, but felt with absolute certainty. We abandoned the trail immediately, cutting directly through the underbrush toward the direction we had come from. Neither of us spoke about our decision. There was no debate, no weighing of options. Some primal instinct had taken control, bypassing rational thought in favor of immediate flight. I took the lead, pushing aside branches and scrambling over fallen logs with reckless speed. Thorns tore at my clothes and roots threatened to trip me with every step, but I couldn't slow down. The compulsion to flee was overwhelming, driving me forward despite the growing burn in my lungs and the protest of muscles already fatigued from the morning's hike. Andre followed close behind. I could hear his ragged breathing, occasionally punctuated by muttered curses when a branch snapped back or his foot slipped on loose soil. We were making far too much noise, crashing through the forest like wounded animals, but stealth seemed less important than speed. Every few minutes, I found myself glancing upward through gaps in the canopy, searching for any sign of the shadow's return. The patches of visible sky remained clear and blue, yet this offered little comfort. Whatever had passed over us hadn't announced its presence before appearing. There was no reason to believe we would have warning should it come again. After perhaps 20 minutes of headlong retreat, I stumbled into a small stream that cut across our path. The shock of cold water against my ankles brought me to an abrupt halt. Andre nearly collided with me, catching himself against a nearby tree trunk. "Wait," he gasped, bending double to catch his breath. "Just a minute." I realized I was breathing hard too, my chest heaving with exertion and fear. Sweat drenched my shirt despite the now cool air. I leaned against a boulder beside the stream, trying to slow my racing heart. "Do you think—" Andre began, then paused to suck in another breath. "Do you think we're far enough away?" The question hung between us, impossible to answer. Far enough away from what? We couldn't name what we were fleeing from because we hadn't seen it. Only its shadow, only its effects on the world around us. "I don't know," I admitted. "But we can't keep running blind through the woods. We'll end up lost or injured." Andre nodded, straightening up. "The trail can't be far. We've been moving roughly parallel to it." He pulled out the crumpled map, trying to orient himself. After a moment, he pointed to our right. "That way, maybe half a mile." We moved more deliberately now, still hurrying, but with enough caution to avoid injury. The forest around us had regained some of its normal sounds, the chirp of birds, the rustle of small creatures in the underbrush, but these seemed subdued, as though the wildlife remained wary. "What do you think it was?" Andre asked finally, breaking the silence between us. I shook my head. "I don't know. Not a cloud, not a plane. Too big for a bird," he added, "and too fast. And the wind after," I said. "That wasn't natural." Andre nodded grimly. "The way everything went quiet." We fell silent again, neither wanting to give voice to the more disturbing possibilities that lurked at the edges of reason. In broad daylight, surrounded by the familiar sights and sounds of a California forest, it seemed absurd to consider anything beyond the rational world. Yet what we had experienced defied rational explanation. After about 15 minutes, we intersected with the trail again. The sight of the well-worn path brought a surge of relief that was almost physical in its intensity. Here was something man-made, something that led back to civilization and normalcy. "We made good time," Andre said, checking his watch. "If we keep moving, we can be back at the truck in an hour, maybe less." We set a brisk pace, no longer stopping to admire views or photograph interesting features as we had on the outward journey. The beauty of the coastline now seemed tainted, its wildness transformed from appealing to threatening. I wanted only to return to the familiar confines of buildings and roads, places where shadows behaved according to known laws of physics. As we walked, I found myself repeatedly checking the sky and monitoring the temperature of the air around us. Any slight dimming of the light or shift in the breeze sent a jolt of adrenaline through my system. Andre must have felt the same. I noticed how his shoulders tensed whenever a cloud temporarily obscured the sun. We encountered two other hikers heading in the opposite direction, a middle-aged couple equipped with professional-looking gear and walking sticks. They greeted us cheerfully, commenting on the perfect weather and asking if we'd seen any whales from the bluffs. We responded with forced smiles and vague answers, neither of us willing to share what had driven us to flee. What could we have said that wouldn't have sounded completely irrational? After they passed, Andre looked at me. Should we have warned them? I frowned, uncertain. Warned them about what? A shadow we can't explain? They'd think we were crazy. He nodded reluctantly. I guess you're right. But the encounter left me uneasy. Were we sending those innocent hikers towards something dangerous? Or had our experience been some kind of shared hallucination, a momentary glitch in perception that wouldn't repeat itself? The trailhead came into view shortly after 2 o'clock. The gravel parking lot, with its weathered information board and basic facilities, had never looked so welcoming. Andre's truck sat where we had left it, sunlight glinting off its windshield. We reached the vehicle in silence, tossing our packs into the bed with motions that betrayed our lingering tension. Once inside the cab, neither of us made an immediate move to leave. Instead, we sat side by side, staring through the windshield at the forest we had just escaped. It was probably nothing, Andre said finally, his tone suggesting he didn't believe his own words. A weird atmospheric thing, or He trailed off, unable to formulate a convincing explanation. Right, I agreed, equally unconvincing. Just one of those things. He started the engine, and as we pulled away from the trailhead, I felt a complex mixture of relief and disquiet. We were safe, heading back to the predictable world of streetlights and cell phone signals. Yet something fundamental had shifted. A crack had appeared in my understanding of reality, and I wasn't sure it could ever be repaired. Andre dropped me off at my apartment without coming inside, breaking our usual post-hike routine of sharing a beer and recounting the day's journey. His goodbye was hurried, almost perfunctory, as though he couldn't wait to create distance, not just from the trail, but from me as well. As if my presence was an uncomfortable reminder of what we had experienced. I watched his truck disappear down the street before entering my building. The familiar surroundings of my apartment should have been comforting, but instead they felt oddly insubstantial. The solid walls and ceiling, the furniture I had carefully selected, the photographs and books that defined my personal space, all seemed fragile in a way they hadn't before, as though their reality had been called into question. I showered mechanically, washing away the physical traces of the hike, dirt, sweat, the scratches from branches, while my mind replayed the moment in the clearing over and over. The sudden darkness, the overwhelming silence, the cold wind that followed like the exhale of something vast. Afterward, I sat on my couch and turned on the television, seeking the mind-numbing distraction of background noise. The normality of news anchors discussing politics and weather forecasters pointing at maps struck me as absurd. How could the world continue its ordinary patterns when something so extraordinary had occurred? I found myself unable to focus on anything for more than a few minutes. I tried reading, then browsing the internet, then preparing dinner, but my thoughts continually returned to the shadow. It was as though a splinter had lodged in my mind, impossible to ignore and resistant to removal. That night, rest wouldn't come. I lay awake, staring at the shifting patterns of streetlight on my ceiling. Each time I closed my eyes, I saw the shadow passing over the clearing. Each time I began to drift off, the sensation of that cold, unnatural wind jerked me back to consciousness. Around 3 a.m, I gave up on sleep entirely. I moved to my desk and opened my laptop, driven by a need to understand, to find some explanation that would allow me to file away the experience as something known and therefore manageable. Searched for natural phenomena that could create fast-moving shadows without visible causes. I read about unusual weather patterns, about optical illusions caused by atmospheric conditions, about rare cloud formations invisible except for their shadows. None of these explanations seemed adequate to what we had witnessed. Next, I ventured into more speculative territory: UFO sightings, unexplained aerial phenomena, cryptozoological accounts of flying creatures. The websites devoted to these topics were filled with blurry photographs, breathless first-hand accounts, and theories ranging from the pseudo-scientific to the wildly conspiratorial. I found myself simultaneously drawn to and repelled by these explanations, wanting to believe that others had experienced something similar, while fearing the implications if they had. Dawn found me still at my computer, eyes burning from fatigue but mind refusing to rest. I had dozens of browser tabs open, had filled pages of notes with possible explanations, had even sketched rough approximations of the shadow's shape and movement based on my memory. None of it brought me closer to understanding. I called in sick to work on Monday, unable to face the prospect of pretending normalcy through client meetings and spreadsheet reviews. Instead, I spent the day in a state of exhausted hypervigilance, watching the sky through my apartment windows, startling at any unusual shadow or sound. I tried calling Andre twice. Both times the call went to voicemail. When he finally texted back late in the afternoon, his message was brief. "Not feeling great. Talk later this week." I recognized the avoidance strategy because I was employing a version of it myself. By not discussing what had happened, Perhaps we could convince ourselves it hadn't been as inexplicable as it seemed. Perhaps, given enough time, the memory would lose its disturbing clarity and join the ranks of strange but dismissible life experiences. But as days passed, I found the memory refused to fade. It remained vivid, intrusive, coloring my perception of the world in subtle but persistent ways. I returned to work, went through the motions of my daily routine, smiled and nodded through conversations about weekend plans and office politics. Yet beneath this veneer of normalcy, something had fundamentally changed. I found myself unable to enter open spaces without scanning the sky. I flinched at sudden shadows, tensed at unexpected gusts of wind. I began to sleep with my lights on, unable to tolerate the darkness that now seemed to hold potential for something more than the absence of light. When Andre and I finally met for dinner the following weekend, our conversation was stilted, circling around the subject we both needed to address. We discussed work, complained about colleagues, debated the merits of a new restaurant downtown, everything except what had happened on the trail. It was only after our second round of drinks that Andre finally broke the unspoken agreement to avoid the topic. "Have you been back?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. I knew immediately what he meant. "No, have you?" He shook his head. "I've been thinking about it, though. A lot." "Me too," I admitted. "I've been researching possibilities." Andre's expression revealed both interest and reluctance. "Find anything?" "Nothing that makes sense. Nothing that feels right." He nodded slowly, then leaned closer across the table. "I saw it again," he said, his voice dropping to just above a whisper. "Not the shadow itself, but something similar." My heart rate accelerated. "Where? When?" "Tuesday evening. I was driving back from my sister's place in Mendocino. It was almost sunset, and I was on that stretch of Highway 1 that runs right along the coast." He paused, taking a sip of his drink. The sky got dark for a second, not like before, not as complete, but the same quality to it. And there was that wind again, strong enough to push against the truck. I felt a chill spread through me. "Did you see anything?" "No," he said, "but I felt it. Like something massive was passing overhead. Like whatever we encountered on the trail is moving up and down the coastline." The implications of his words hung between us. If what we had experienced wasn't an isolated incident, if the phenomenon was mobile and recurring, then it wasn't something we could simply avoid by staying away from the Lost Coast Trail. It was something that existed in our world, something that could appear again anywhere, anytime. "What do we do?" I asked finally. Andre shook his head, his expression grim. "I don't know that there's anything we can do. Except maybe," he hesitated. "What?" "Go back," he said. "Go back to the clearing where it happened. Try to understand." The suggestion filled me with instinctive dread. Why would we do that? "Because whatever this is, it's not going away. At least not for me." His eyes met mine, searching. "I need to know if I'm losing my mind, or if we really encountered something unexplainable." I wanted to argue, to insist that returning to the scene was unnecessary and potentially dangerous. But I recognized the truth in his words. The splinter in my mind would not work itself out through avoidance. Understanding, or at least confrontation, was the only path forward. "Okay," I said reluctantly. "We go back." Before returning to the Lost Coast Trail, I dedicated myself to thorough preparation. If we were to confront something potentially dangerous, we needed to arm ourselves with as much knowledge as possible. The weekend excursion would have to wait. First, I needed to research. I began systematically, creating a document to catalog similar reported phenomena, starting with scientific journals and academic databases accessible through my company's research portal. I searched for unusual atmospheric events, unexplained aerial shadows, and localized weather anomalies along the California coast. Most of the results were easily explainable: cloud shadows, temperature inversions, rare but documented meteorological occurrences. None matched the specific combination of effects we had experienced. The solid shadow moving independently of cloud cover, the targeted cold wind that followed, the unnatural silence that descended on the surrounding environment. I expanded my search to include government records. The FAA had no reports of unauthorized aircraft in the area on the day of our hike. NOAA weather data showed no unusual patterns or anomalies that might explain what we had witnessed. Local news archives contained nothing about strange sightings or experiences near the Lost Coast during that period. As legitimate sources failed to yield answers, I reluctantly turned to less credible ones. UFO reporting websites, paranormal forums, and conspiracy theory boards became my late-night reading. I created anonymous accounts to ask questions about our experience, being careful to phrase my inquiries hypothetically to avoid appearing unhinged. The responses varied wildly. Some suggested conventional explanations I had already considered and dismissed. Others offered supernatural theories involving everything from interdimensional beings to government experiments with advanced technology. A few respondents claimed to have experienced similar phenomena, but none provided details specific enough to convince me they had encountered the same thing we had. In the midst of this increasingly frustrating research, I received a promising lead from an unexpected source. An elderly librarian at the County Historical Society responded to my email inquiry about local legends or historical accounts of unusual natural phenomena. She mentioned a collection of journals written by a lighthouse keeper who had worked at the Punta Gorda light station near the southern portion of the Lost Coast from 1942 to 1951. These journals haven't been fully catalogued, she wrote, but I recall entries describing something the keeper called the darkening. Periodic events where a shadow would pass over the station, followed by what he described as a wind that carries no scent of the sea. Given your research interests, these accounts might be relevant. The following day, I drove to the Historical Society's archives, located in a basement room of the county library. The librarian, Mrs. Winters, had prepared the journals for my visit. The leather-bound volumes were worn with age, their pages yellowed and fragile. Joseph Calloway kept meticulous records, Mrs. Winters explained as she guided me through the handling protocols. Most entries deal with weather conditions, maintenance tasks, and ship sightings. But beginning in February 1945, he started documenting these unusual occurrences. I spent hours carefully turning the pages, scanning Calloway's neat handwriting for mentions of the darkening. The first relevant entry appeared on February 17, 1945. Unusual occurrence today at approximately 14:20 hours. While performing routine maintenance on the lens assembly, I observed what I can only describe as a darkening that passed over the station. The sky remained clear, yet a shadow moved across the ground as if cast by an immense object. The event lasted perhaps 5-7 seconds. Following this, a strong cold wind blew from the northwest, despite the day being otherwise still. Most peculiar was the complete silence that fell. No birds, no insects, not even the eternal sound of waves against the rocks below. I have logged this phenomenon as the darkening for future reference. My hands trembled as I read the entry. The description matched our experience with unsettling precision, the same progression of shadow, wind, and silence. Calloway had witnessed the same phenomenon nearly 75 years earlier. Subsequent entries revealed that the lighthouse keeper had observed the darkening 14 times over a 6-year period. The occurrences followed no discernible pattern in terms of timing or frequency, though Calloway noted they seemed more common during clear weather and often happened near midday. Most disturbing was an entry from August 3, 1947. The darkening occurred again today, more pronounced than previous instances. I was not alone in witnessing it this time. Howard Bryce, who delivers our monthly supplies, was present. Upon experiencing the phenomenon, Bryce became extremely agitated, claiming he had encountered the same thing while fishing off Shelter Cove last month. According to Bryce, his fishing companion, William Foster, became so disturbed by the experience that he waded into the surf immediately afterward, as if in a trance. Foster drowned before Bryce could reach him. Authorities ruled it an accident, but Bryce is convinced the shadow took him. I record this account with reservation, as Bryce is known to embellish. Yet his description of the event itself aligns precisely with my observations. I photographed the relevant pages with my phone, thanked Mrs. Winters for her assistance, and left the archives with a mixture of validation and intensified unease. The journals confirmed that what Andre and I had experienced was real and had been occurring in the region for decades, possibly longer. But they also suggested a potential danger we hadn't considered, that the phenomenon might have some kind of psychological effect on those who witnessed it. That evening I called Andre to share my findings. His initial skepticism gave way to troubled acceptance as I read Calloway's entries aloud. "So this thing has been around for at least 75 years, he said when I finished. "Maybe much longer if there are accounts from before Calloway. And it seems to be concentrated along the Lost Coast," I added. "Though your experience on Highway 1 suggests it ranges farther at times. What about this guy Foster who drowned? You think the shadow caused that somehow?" I hesitated. "It's a second-hand account, possibly exaggerated. But yes, it raises concerns about psychological effects. Did you feel anything unusual after your experience on Highway 1? Any compulsions or altered states?" "No," Andre said firmly. "Just fear. Natural fear." "Same here," I agreed. "But we should be careful when we go back. Stay aware of any unusual thoughts or impulses." We planned our return to the Lost Coast for the following weekend. This time, we would bring additional equipment, cameras with wide-angle lenses to capture as much of the sky as possible, a digital thermometer to record temperature fluctuations, a handheld weather station to measure wind speed and barometric pressure, and a digital audio recorder to document any changes in ambient sound. "If this thing appears again," Andre said, "we'll have more than just our memories as evidence." As we finalized preparations, I couldn't shake a growing sense of dread. We were deliberately returning to encounter something unexplainable, something that had existed long enough to establish a historical pattern, something that might have influenced at least one person to walk to their death. Yet beneath the fear was a compelling need to understand, to confront the crack that had appeared in my perception of reality and either repair it with explanation or learn to live with its implications. The night before our planned return, I dreamed of the clearing. In the dream, the shadow passed over not once but repeatedly, each time lingering longer, each time bringing a colder wind and a deeper silence, until the world around me seemed frozen in a twilight state, neither day nor night. I woke gasping, my room too dark, too quiet. The lingering sensation of being observed by something vast and patient following me into consciousness. Dawn couldn't come quickly enough. The drive back to the Lost Coast Trail unfolded in tense silence. Andre focused intently on the road, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. I monitored our equipment, checking batteries and settings with obsessive precision, anything to occupy my mind and suppress the growing apprehension. We arrived at the trailhead shortly after 9 in the morning. The parking lot contained only one other vehicle, a mud-splattered Jeep with kayak racks. The day was clear and mild, remarkably similar to our previous visit. This meteorological consistency seemed significant somehow, aligning with Calloway's observation that the darkening often occurred during fair weather. As we prepared to set out, I found myself hesitating, overcome by a sudden urge to abandon our plan. "Maybe this is a mistake," I said, adjusting the straps of my backpack without looking at Andre. "We've come this far," he replied, though his tone lacked conviction. "We need answers. And if we don't find any, if nothing happens, then at least we tried. Better than spending the rest of our lives jumping at shadows." His words resonated with my own thoughts. The experience had already altered us. Returning to normal seemed impossible without confrontation and resolution. I nodded and we set off along the now familiar trail. Our pace was deliberate, neither rushing toward nor avoiding our destination. We spoke little, conserving energy and attention for what might await us. I found myself cataloging every detail of the surrounding environment. The precise quality of sunlight filtering through leaves, the specific calls of birds overhead, the exact feel of the breeze against my skin. It was as though by anchoring myself firmly in observable reality, I could better identify any deviation from it. We reached the clearing shortly before noon. It appeared exactly as I remembered. The flat boulder positioned to offer views of both ocean and forest, the open expanse of grass, the perimeter of trees swaying slightly in the coastal breeze. Nothing about the space suggested it had been the site of an encounter with something beyond conventional understanding. "Here we are," Andre said unnecessarily, dropping his pack beside the boulder. I set down my own backpack and began removing our equipment. We positioned cameras on small tripods at the north and south edges of the clearing, angled upward to capture maximum sky coverage. The weather station went on top of the boulder, its digital display already registering temperature, 68 degree, wind speed, 3 mph from the west, and barometric pressure, 3012 in Hg. The audio recorder I placed on a flat stone near the center of the clearing. With our instruments in place, we settled onto the boulder to wait. Andre checked his watch. "It happened around noon last time," he said. "If it follows any pattern at all." "We don't know that it will appear again," I reminded him. "Calloway's journal suggests the occurrences are irregular." "I know, but it feels right being here now, like something's due." I understood what he meant. There was a tension in the air, a sense of anticipation that transcended simple anxiety. Perhaps it was merely the power of suggestion, our minds primed to perceive significance in ordinary phenomena. Or perhaps it was something more, some subtle change in the environment that registered below the threshold of conscious perception. Minutes passed. The digital display on the weather station showed minimal fluctuations in conditions. Birds continued their calls in the surrounding forest. Waves crashed rhythmically against the distant shore. Everything remained stubbornly, insistently normal. At 12:37, Andre stood abruptly. "Did you hear that?" I listened intently but detected nothing unusual. "What?" "A kind of humming, very low, almost more like feeling it than hearing it." I shook my head. "Nothing." He frowned, turning slowly in place as if trying to locate the source of the sound. "It's gone now, but it was there, like a vibration coming through the ground." I checked the audio recorder's display, which showed no significant change in ambient sound levels. The weather station likewise registered no unusual readings, yet Andre's expression, a mixture of confusion and growing alarm, convinced me he had perceived something real. "Keep watching the instruments," I said. "I'll check the cameras." As I moved toward the nearest camera, I became aware of a subtle change in the quality of light around us. It wasn't a dimming exactly, more a shift in the spectrum, as though the sunlight had taken on a slightly different frequency. Colors seemed less vivid, shadows more pronounced. "Andre," I began, turning back toward him. The words died in my throat. Above the clearing, the sky had begun to ripple. There's no better word for it. Like the surface of a pond disturbed by a stone, concentric waves of distortion spread across the otherwise clear blue expanse. The effect was subtle at first, barely perceptible but rapidly intensifying. "Are you seeing this?" Andre's voice sounded distant despite his being only feet away. "Yes," I managed. "The cameras. Check the readings," he interrupted, pointing to the weather station. The digital display showed rapid changes. Temperature dropping, now 61 driven falling. Wind speed increasing, 12 Baltimore palm, direction shifting erratically. Barometric pressure fluctuating wildly. As I watched, the audio recorder's levels dipped sharply, indicating a sudden decrease in ambient sound. Then the birdsong stopped. The insect buzz ceased. Even the constant backdrop of waves against shore faded to nothing. The silence that descended was absolute and unnatural, a vacuum of sound that seemed to press against my eardrums. "It's happening," Andre whispered, the words barely audible even in the complete quiet. Like before, but more. The rippling in the sky intensified, the distortions converging toward a central point directly above the clearing. As they merged, the blue began to darken. Not to the black of night, but to something deeper. A color that seemed to absorb light rather than merely lacking it. The wind rose suddenly, whistling through the trees at the clearing's edge and bending the grass in circular patterns around us. It carried that same metallic scent I remembered from our first encounter, but stronger now, almost caustic. "The equipment," I said, lunging toward the nearest camera. But even as I moved, a transformation occurred overhead. The rippling distortions coalesced into a defined shape, a vast disk of absolute darkness that hung suspended above the clearing. Not a shadow cast by something else, but a thing in itself, an absence given form. The disk began to rotate slowly, its edges rippling like black flames against the sky. As it turned, the temperature plummeted further. My breath fogged in the suddenly frigid air. The wind intensified, now howling around us with hurricane force. Yet somehow the equipment remained undisturbed, as though the gusts were selective in what they affected. Andre stood transfixed, his face upturned toward the phenomenon, eyes wide and reflecting the impossible darkness above. "Do you see it?" he asked, voice trembling. "Really see it?" I followed his gaze more carefully, forcing myself to look beyond the obvious shape of the disk. Within its rotating blackness, patterns emerged, suggestions of structure, of geometry that seemed to fold in on itself in ways that strained comprehension. The longer I looked, the more complex these patterns became, spiraling inward toward a center that seemed impossibly distant despite being directly overhead. A pressure began to build inside my skull, not pain exactly, but a sense of expansion, as though my consciousness was being stretched to accommodate something my brain wasn't designed to process. Equations and symbols flashed through my mind, mathematical concepts I'd never studied, yet suddenly half understood. "We need to leave," I said, tearing my eyes away from the disk with immense effort. "Now?" But Andre didn't move. His expression had changed from fear to something closer to wonder. "It's trying to communicate," he said softly. "Can't you feel it?" Indeed, beneath the howling wind and pressure in my head, I sensed something else, a rhythmic pulsation that seemed to bypass my ears and resonate directly in my mind. Not language as I understood it, but patterns of meaning that hovered just beyond comprehension. "Andre," I said urgently, grabbing his arm. "We've documented it. That's enough. We need to go." He resisted slightly, still gazing upward. "But don't you want to understand?" "Not like this," I insisted, pulling harder. "Remember Calloway's journal. Remember Foster." The mention of the drowned man seemed to penetrate Andre's fascination. He blinked rapidly, looking away from the disk with visible effort. "Right," he said, his voice clearing. "Right. Let's go." We abandoned the equipment, too afraid to take the time to pack it properly. As we turned to flee, the rotating disk above began to change again. Its edges blurred, extending outward like tendrils of darkness reaching across the sky. The temperature dropped further still, cold enough now that my fingers began to numb and my lungs burned with each breath. The silence gave way to a new sound, a deep, resonant tone that seemed to emanate not from the phenomenon itself, but from the air around us, from the ground beneath our feet, perhaps even from within our own bodies. The tone modulated slowly, rising and falling in a pattern that felt almost like speech. We ran. Through the trees, down the trail, stumbling over roots and rocks in our desperate flight. The darkness pursued us, not physically following, but expanding outward from the clearing, casting a shadow that stretched far beyond what natural physics should allow. I dared not look back, focused only on the path ahead and the sound of Andre's footsteps beside me. The cold receded gradually the further we got from the clearing, the unnatural silence giving way to normal forest sounds. When we finally stopped, perhaps a mile from where we had started, the sky above was blue again, unblemished by rippling distortions or impossible geometries. The equipment, Andre gasped between heaving breaths. We left everything. We'll have to go back for it, I said. But not now. Not today. He nodded, leaning against a tree for support.
What was that thing?
Did you feel it trying to reach into your mind? Yes, I admitted. And for a moment you seemed almost ready to let it. Andre's expression darkened. It felt like it was offering knowledge, understanding. Like if I just listened a little longer, everything would make sense. A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the lingering cold. That's how it happens, I said. That's what happened to Foster, I think. He listened too long. We made our way back to the trailhead in silence, each absorbed in private thoughts about what we had witnessed and what it might mean. The phenomenon had been more than a shadow this time, more than a passing anomaly. It had revealed itself more fully, had attempted some form of contact or communication, and it had almost succeeded. As we reached Andre's truck, a new and troubling thought occurred to me. If the entity, for I could no longer think of it as merely a phenomenon, had been trying to communicate, what was it trying to say? And more importantly, why had it chosen that particular location, that particular moment, those particular observers? The questions followed me into the truck and along the highway toward home, multiplying and expanding just as the darkness had expanded above the clearing. I had sought understanding and now found myself burdened with mysteries far greater than the one I had set out to solve. 3 days after our second encounter on the Lost Coast Trail, Andre called me at 2 a.m. I answered immediately, already awake. Sleep had become elusive, my nights fragmented by recurring dreams of rotating darkness and mathematical patterns beyond my comprehension. "We have to go back," he said without preamble. His voice sounded strange, tight and breathless, as though he was exerting great effort simply to speak. "The equipment, we need to see what it recorded." "In the morning," I replied, alarmed by his urgency. "We can drive up at first light." "No, now. I've already started driving. I'm about 30 minutes from your place." A warning prickle ran along my spine. "Andre, this doesn't sound like you. What's going on?" A long pause followed. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped to a near whisper. "I can still hear it. The humming, the pattern. It's been getting louder since we left. I thought it would fade, but it's doing the opposite." "You need to pull over," I said firmly. "We can talk about this face to face. Don't go back to that clearing alone." Another pause, longer this time. I could hear his breathing, rapid and shallow. "You're right," he said finally. "I'll come to you first. But we need to go back today. I figured something out." "About what it wants." What wants?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "The visitor," he said, using a term neither of us had employed before. "The thing in the sky. I understand now, at least partly. It showed me." Fear coiled in my stomach. "Showed you what?" "It's been here before. Many times. Long before Calloway saw it. There are records going back centuries if you know where to look." His words tumbled out faster now. Native petroglyphs showing a black sun. Spanish missionary accounts of El Disco Negro. Gold Rush diaries mentioning a hole in the heavens. All along the Northern California coast. All describing the same thing. "Where did you find these accounts?" I asked, already reaching for clothes, preparing to meet him. "That's not important. What matters is what the visitor does. Why it appears." His voice dropped again. "It takes people sometimes. Not their bodies, their minds, their consciousness. It collects them, like specimens." "Andre, you're scaring me." "The equipment recorded it all," he continued as though I hadn't spoken. "The cameras, the audio, but especially the weather station. The readings follow a pattern, a mathematical sequence. It's communication, complex but decipherable. How do you know this if we left the equipment there? The question was gentle but direct. A long silence followed. When Andre spoke again, his voice had changed, flatter, more controlled. You're right. We need to retrieve the equipment first. I'll be at your place in 20 minutes. The call ended. I stood in the dark of my apartment, phone still in hand, a deep unease settling over me. Whatever had happened in that clearing, whatever we had encountered, it had affected Andre in ways I was only beginning to understand. The visitor, as he had called it, had established some kind of connection with him. A connection that apparently persisted and was growing stronger. I dressed quickly, then made a decision. Opening my laptop, I composed a detailed email describing everything that had happened since our first hike on the Lost Coast Trail. I attached photos of Calloway's journal entries, my notes from our research, and coordinates for the clearing. After hesitating briefly, I addressed the email to myself with a delayed send of 24 hours. If something happened to us on this return trip, at least some record would remain. Andre arrived precisely when he said he would. His appearance shocked me, eyes bloodshot and sunken, face pale and drawn, hands trembling slightly as they gripped the steering wheel. He looked as though he hadn't slept in days. "Are you okay to drive?" I asked as I climbed into the passenger seat. "Fine," he said curtly. "We need to hurry. Dawn in 3 hours." As we drove through the night, Andre alternated between tense silence and bursts of fragmented explanation about what he believed the visitor to be. His theories ranged from the pseudo-scientific, an interdimensional entity capable of manipulating space-time, to the mythological, a manifestation of what ancient cultures might have interpreted as a god. "It exists primarily in dimensions we can't perceive," he said at one point, eyes fixed on the dark highway ahead. "What we see is just a projection, like a three-dimensional shadow cast by a four-dimensional object." "How do you know this?" I asked carefully. His hands tightened on the steering wheel. "It showed me. In dreams at first, then, more directly. You've seen it again. Since the clearing?" He nodded once, a sharp downward jerk of his chin. "Last night, in my living room, just for a few seconds. A rippling in the air, a patch of darkness that didn't belong, and the humming. Always the humming." I struggled to formulate a response that wouldn't further agitate him. "Andre, have you considered that what you're experiencing might be some kind of after effect? A psychological response to trauma?" His laugh was harsh and brittle. "That's what I thought at first, that I was losing my mind. But then I found the accounts, so many accounts across centuries, all describing the same entity, the same effects, and they all center on that coastline, on places where the boundary between here and elsewhere is thinner." We fell silent again. The night landscape rushed past outside the windows, occasional headlights from oncoming cars briefly illuminating Andre's haggard face. I noticed he kept checking the rearview mirror, his eyes flicking upward with increasing frequency as we approached the coast. "What are you looking for?" I asked finally. "It follows sometimes," he said softly, traveling just above and behind, out of sight, unless you know exactly where to look. I resisted the urge to turn and check for myself. We reached the trailhead parking lot, just as the eastern sky began to lighten with pre-dawn gray. The lot was empty this time, no other vehicles present. Andre grabbed a flashlight from the glove compartment, and we set out along the trail without speaking, our path illuminated by the narrow beam and the gradually strengthening natural light. The forest around us seemed more ominous than before, the familiar shapes of trees and underbrush transformed by shadows and our own apprehension. Every sound, the crack of a twig, the rustle of leaves, caused me to start. Andre moved with single-minded purpose, setting a pace almost too quick to maintain on the uneven terrain. As we approached the clearing, the quality of light began to change in a way that sent a jolt of recognition through me. Not a dimming, but a shift in spectrum, colors less vivid, shadows more pronounced. the same subtle alteration we had observed before the visitor appeared. "Andre," I said, grabbing his arm. "It's happening again. We should go back." He shook off my hand. "That's why we're here, to understand. You're not thinking clearly. Whatever this thing is, it's affecting you." He turned to face me fully, his expression a mixture of impatience and something like pity. "You still don't see, do you? It's not just affecting me, it's revealing itself to me, choosing me. For what? To witness, to understand, to translate." He gestured toward the trail ahead. "Our equipment is just beyond those trees. The data it recorded will prove everything I've been telling you." Reluctantly, I followed him the remaining distance to the clearing. The light continued to shift, taking on an increasingly artificial quality, as though we were moving through a subtly distorted photograph of a forest rather than the forest itself. The clearing appeared before us, eerily unchanged from our previous visits. Our abandoned equipment remained in place, cameras still on their tripods, weather station on the boulder, audio recorder on its stone. Everything looked untouched, despite having been exposed to the elements for 3 days. Andre moved immediately to the weather station, examining its display with intense focus. "The data's still here," he said, his voice rising with excitement. "It kept recording after we left. Look at these patterns." I approached cautiously, peering at the small screen. It showed a series of graphs and numerical values that meant little to me. Temperature fluctuations, pressure readings, wind velocities recorded over time. "I don't see a pattern," I admitted. "You're not looking properly," Andre insisted. "The fluctuations aren't random. They follow a mathematical progression, a language if you know how to read it." As he spoke, I became aware of a sound just at the threshold of hearing, a low, resonant humming that seemed to emanate from multiple directions simultaneously. The sky above the clearing remained blue, but the quality of light continued to change, becoming increasingly diffuse and directionless. "We need to collect the equipment and leave," I said firmly. "Whatever data it recorded, we can analyze it somewhere safe." Andre ignored me, moving to check the cameras. "The memory cards are full," he reported. "Hours of footage." The humming grew slightly louder, now accompanied by a subtle vibration in the ground beneath my feet. Birds that had been calling in the surrounding forest fell silent. A cold breeze stirred the grass around us, carrying that now familiar metallic scent. "Andre," I said urgently, "it's coming again. We need to go now." He straightened, turning to face me with an expression of calm resignation. "I know. That's why we're here." Before I could respond, the air above the clearing began to ripple. The distortions spread rapidly, converging toward a central point as they had before. The humming intensified, resolving into a complex pattern that seemed to resonate directly in my bones. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing Andre's arm and pulling him toward the trail. He resisted, planting his feet firmly. "No, I need to stay. I need to understand the message." "There is no message," I insisted, desperation rising. "Whatever this thing is, it's dangerous. Remember Foster. Remember how you've been since we last saw it." Andre's eyes fixed on the rippling sky. Foster understood. He went willingly. Not to death, to knowledge. The distortions coalesced into the now familiar disk of absolute darkness, rotating slowly above the clearing. The temperature plummeted, the wind rose to a howl, and in the center of the disk, something new appeared, a vortex of deeper blackness, spiraling inward toward a point that seemed simultaneously infinitely distant and directly overhead. "Look," Andre whispered, pointing upward. "It's opening, showing us the way." I looked despite myself, and for a moment, just a moment, I thought I glimpsed something beyond the vortex. Not stars or sky or any familiar celestial body, but a landscape of impossible geometry, structures that folded through dimensions I couldn't comprehend, entities that moved with purpose through spaces that shouldn't exist. A pressure built inside my skull, expanding with every second I stared into the vortex. Equations and symbols flashed through my mind as before, but clearer now, closer to understanding. The patterns were resolving into meaning, the chaos organizing itself into a kind of language that bypassed conventional thought. With immense effort, I tore my gaze away, focusing instead on Andre. His face was upturned, eyes wide and reflecting the swirling darkness above. A thin trickle of blood ran from his nose, but he seemed unaware of it. His lips moved silently as though reciting something only he could hear. "Andre," I shouted, but my voice seemed to disappear into the howling wind. I grabbed his shoulders, physically turning him away from the vortex. "We have to leave." For a moment he resisted, body rigid and unresponsive. Then his eyes focused on mine, and I saw recognition flicker there, followed by fear. "Help me," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "It's in my head. It wants me to go to it." I gripped his arm and pulled him toward the trail with all my strength. This time he came, stumbling like a sleepwalker abruptly awakened. Behind us the humming shifted in pitch, taking on a quality that somehow conveyed displeasure or frustration. We had reached the edge of the clearing when Andre suddenly stiffened and turned back. "The equipment," he said. "We can't leave it again. The proof. Leave it," I shouted, pulling harder. Something in my tone must have reached him because he nodded once and continued moving. We pushed into the forest, the trail barely visible in the distorted light. Above us, through gaps in the canopy, I could see the darkness spreading, the vortex expanding as though reaching out to follow our retreat. The cold pursued us, along with that resonant humming that now seemed to contain distinct tones, a communication becoming more insistent, more demanding. Andre moved with increasing difficulty, each step appearing to require immense effort, as though he was fighting not just the entity's mental pull, but some physical resistance as well. "Don't listen to it," I urged him. "Focus on me, on my voice, one step at a time." We had covered perhaps half a mile when Andre collapsed, falling to his knees on the trail. His eyes rolled back, showing whites, and his body began to convulse. "Andre." I knelt beside him, unsure whether to restrain him or not. "Andre, stay with me." The convulsions stopped as suddenly as they had begun. His eyes opened, focusing on something beyond me, beyond the forest canopy overhead. "I understand now," he said, his voice unnervingly calm. "What it wants, what it's always wanted." "What?" I asked, desperate to keep him engaged, to prevent him from slipping back into whatever trance had claimed him. "Witnesses," he said simply. "Conscious observers. It needs them to fully manifest in our reality." "Why? What is it?" Andre's eyes found mine, clear and lucid despite everything. "Something old. Something that exists primarily in dimensions adjacent to ours. It can't fully enter our reality without being observed, without consciousness to collapse its wave function, to make it real." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Quantum mechanics on a macro scale. The observer effect writ large. I didn't understand, not fully, but the terror in my chest expanded nonetheless. "And what happens to the observers? To people like Foster? They become part of it, their consciousness absorbed, integrated." His expression turned distant again. Not death. Transformation. The humming grew louder around us, the air beginning to ripple even here, beneath the forest canopy. The cold intensified, my breath fogging in the rapidly chilling air. "It's coming," Andre whispered. "You should run. Get as far away as possible." "Not without you," I insisted, pulling him to his feet with desperate strength. He stood unsteadily, leaning heavily against me. "I don't know if I can fight it much longer. The pull is too strong." "You can," I said firmly. "One step at a time. Focus on the physical. The ground under your feet, my hand on your arm. Stay anchored in this reality." We moved forward again, each step a battle against both the uneven terrain and the invisible force that seemed intent on drawing Andre back toward the clearing. The rippling in the air followed us, tendrils of distortion reaching through the trees like searching fingers. Time became difficult to track. It might have been minutes or hours that we struggled along the trail, the entity's presence pursuing us like a predator reluctant to abandon its chosen prey. The humming continued, now interspersed with what sounded almost like words. Incomprehensible yet somehow familiar, as though in another moment I might understand them. Finally, mercifully, we reached the trailhead. Andre's truck sat where we had left it, solid and ordinary, an anchor to the conventional world. I helped him into the passenger seat, then rushed around to the driver's side, grabbing the keys from his unresisting hand. As I started the engine, I risked a glance in the rearview mirror. The trail behind us appeared normal, trees and underbrush lit by morning sunlight, no sign of rippling air or spreading darkness. Yet a sense of watchful presence remained, a feeling of being observed by something vast and patient. We drove in silence for several miles, the forest giving way to coastal grasslands and eventually to the familiar landscape of highways and human habitation. With each mile, Andre seemed to recover slightly, his breathing becoming more regular, his posture less rigid. "It's fading," he said finally. "The pull, the connection, I can feel it getting weaker." Relief flooded through me. "Good, that's good." He turned to look at me, his expression troubled. "But it's not gone completely, and I don't think it ever will be." He pressed his fingers to his temples. "It's like a splinter in my mind, a channel that's been opened and can't be fully closed. We'll figure it out," I promised, though I had no idea how. "Whatever this is, we'll face it together." Andre nodded, but the gesture lacked conviction. "It will come again," he said quietly. "Not just to that clearing, but to other places. Other times. It's been doing this for centuries, maybe longer. Finding witnesses, creating connections, preparing. Preparing for what?" He shook his head slowly. "I don't know. Not completely, but I saw glimpses, a convergence, a thinning of boundaries between here and elsewhere. Something coming through more fully than before." We fell silent again, each absorbed in our own thoughts as the miles passed. The ordinary world continued around us, traffic lights changing, people going about their morning routines, reality proceeding according to familiar laws of physics. Yet I knew now that this normalcy was only a thin veneer, a comfortable illusion maintained by our limited perception. Something existed beyond or adjacent to our reality, something ancient and intelligent, something that had taken an interest in humanity for reasons we couldn't fully comprehend. And it had touched us, had left its mark on Andre in ways that might never fully heal. As we approached the outskirts of town, Andre spoke again, his voice quiet but steadier than before. "We need to warn people," he said. "About the lost coast, about the clearing." I nodded slowly. "But who would believe us? What proof do we have?" "None," he admitted. "We left the equipment behind. And even if we hadn't, I'm not sure any conventional recording device could fully capture what we experienced." "Then what do we do?" Andre was silent for a long moment. "We document everything. Every detail we can remember, every sensation, every observation. And we watch for signs, for reports of similar phenomena in other locations, for people describing experiences like ours. And then we try to understand, not just what the entity is, but what it wants, why it chooses certain people, certain places." His expression darkened. "And we stay away from the lost coast, from any place where the boundary seems thin." I agreed, though a part of me doubted whether such avoidance was truly possible. If the entity had chosen Andre, had established some kind of connection with him, could distance alone sever that link? We reached my apartment building in the early afternoon. Andre declined my invitation to come inside, saying he needed time alone to process everything, to sort through what was implanted and what was real. I watched his truck pull away with a sense of foreboding, wondering if he would ever fully return from that clearing, if something essential had been irretrievably altered. That night I began writing this account, every detail I could recall, every sensation and observation from our encounters with what Andre had called the visitor. I don't know if anyone will ever read these words or if they would believe them if they did. But the act of documentation itself feels like a small rebellion against the unknown, a way of asserting human consciousness and comprehension in the face of something that defies both. Andre and I still meet occasionally, though our conversations carefully avoid direct mention of what happened. Sometimes I catch him staring at the sky or tilting his head as though listening to something I cannot hear. In those moments, I know the connection remains, weakened perhaps, but present. As for me, I found myself unable to look at the night sky without wondering what lies beyond or between the stars we can see. I avoid open spaces on clear days, flinching at passing shadows and sudden changes in temperature. And sometimes, in the moments between wakefulness and sleep, I hear a faint humming, a complex pattern of tones that seems just on the verge of resolving into meaning. I tell myself it's memory, not reality, that the entity, whatever it was, remains confined to that distant clearing on the lost coast. But deep down, I know this is wishful thinking. Whatever we encountered exists and continues to exist, with or without our observation. And somewhere, somehow, it is watching, waiting, preparing for what I fear we may one day discover.